We're going to look at some things that kind of lead us into this first lesson that gets to page 8 in the book. This first lesson is probably a little bit longer lesson than what some of them will be, because we're going into some detail about some things that kind of lead us up to our discussion on Sarah. And I am planning on, at the end of each lesson, just probably it probably won't take long, but I am planning on just asking each one of those questions in the book, because I figure if you take time to answer them in preparation for class, then we need to take time to ask them, and a lot of them will just take a few seconds. And anyway, so just want you to know that I'm planning on doing that, and we may get to those, depending on how far we get today, we may get to those Wednesday, or we may actually have another class period on this particular introduction and lesson 1. See if I had any other notes to think about. Nope. Okay, so we're going to start with prayer in a moment. Effie's going to lead us, but we'll have a few charts leading up. We're going to be looking at some things that lead up to the point A on page 8, where the author says that Sarah is a descendant of Seth and of Shem. Anyway, we're going to lead up to that point, and then we'll go from there. And after we discuss some of these things, then we'll start looking at the text where we find Sarah, especially in Genesis, and discuss some of those things. So, Effie, would you hang on a second? Effie, would you word us in prayer? Thank you.
Father, praise about. We praise you this morning, the fact that we can come and worship in a church where all teachings are true and have not been diluted, perverted by the teaching of man. Father, we ask that you bless each member here, or each member of this congregation, especially those who have health issues, and we're especially prayerful for Miss Shirley as she's going to her chemo treatment, and pray that the time will come shortly when she'll be able to return to us. And also, Father, I'd like to remember Miss Farmer, who's just not able to get out and come. Father, continue to bless her. At this time, Father, we do pray for our elders who guide this church and our deacons and the work that they do, and especially thankful for Jack and Scott who stepped up and said that they're willing to serve and will be returned shortly. And Father, at this time, we ask that you be with the Bible lab downstairs, and the teachers, students down there, that they have a wonderful learning experience today. And Father, we likewise here, we pray that you'll be with Perry as he leads us through this class, and be a edifying situation for us, and his leader, your son, Jesus' precious and holy name we pray.
Amen. So you may remember this, or you may have had a couple of minutes here to look it up right quick. How old was Abraham when he died? Pardon? 175 years old. How old was Sarah when she died? Yeah, 127. Heard several people say that. And I want us to think about that, and we're going to right quick look at how long man lived, just a couple minutes, and get down to the time of Terah and Abraham. And so we have a chart here. Abraham died at 175, Sarah at 127, and here's how long men were living. At the beginning there, Adam 930, you keep on going down. Noah 950 years, he lived 350 years after the flood. And then you start seeing less of a lifespan here with Shelah, etc. And of course, we might expect that in one sense, as far as man at the beginning multiplying and replenishing the earth, and so living hundreds and hundreds of years in order to do that. But that thought continues. Peleg, now you see men somewhere living around 200 and something years. Then you have Terah, who was 205. We said Abraham, 175. Isaac, 180. You get on down here to Joseph, 110. Moses was 120. Joshua, 110. David, about 70 years. And then Psalms 90 says, really, to our day and time, about 70 years, or if by reason of strength and so forth, maybe 80. And so when you look at this and we think about the time frame of Abraham and Sarah, what would be, if someone didn't have an early death, what would you say would be an average lifespan during that time frame? Yeah, how many years? Okay. I said that there's no wrong answer. I said 200 just because I was putting all these facts together. Of course, concerning Abraham, it did say that he lived to be a ripe old age, right? But I just used the life expectancy of being about 200 years. And what I was wanting to do is think about all that's said about Sarah and how many years she actually lived, as far as maybe if the average lifespan was about 200 years during the time that she lived. She died at the age of 127. Just using that mathematically, she lived about 60. When she died, she lived about 64% of her life, based on an average lifespan of 200. And just to put that in perspective, that's like one of us dying. If we use 80 years for an average lifespan today, that'd be like one of us dying at 51. So Sarah died at, I don't know if we'd say young age, but approximately 60% of her life, and then she dies. And the reason I wanted to bring that out is because the book of Genesis has 50 chapters. You go from Adam to Joseph, to the death of Joseph, and it covers a period of about 2,500 years. How many chapters give us information about Sarah? You got any guesses? Pardon? Out of 50 chapters. It's less than 10. 4 is higher than 4. Okay, it's 8. I'll just give you the answer because I didn't ask that question ahead of time. It's 8. And here they are. Here's the chapters in Genesis that mention Sarah. In chapter 11, right at the very end of chapter 11, she's barren. She goes with Abraham. They're going to journey ultimately to Canaan. In chapter 12, they're in Egypt, and she is taken into Pharaoh's house, and that's something we'll be discussing at some point. In chapter 16, she's still barren. It makes the point that she's still barren, and so that's when she gives Hagar to Abraham, going to help God out with his plan, so to speak. Chapter 17, that's where her name is changed from Sarai to Sarah. And I'll be saying Sarah and Abraham, even though if we're talking about areas before their name changed, but that's just easier for me to do. Chapter 18, that's where she laughs at God's promises, and then they end up going to Gerar. Chapter 20, Abimelech takes Sarah into his house. Chapter 21, that's where Isaac is born, and Sarah turns against Hagar, and then we see her death in chapter 23. And you can see there's a few chapters skipped right in there where she's not mentioned in that particular chapter. But the point I was wanting to make is that Sarah lived, per our perspective, about 51 years, and out of those 2,500 years, Sarah has a little spot here. And then out of those 50 chapters where God chose to give us some detail about man, Sarah has a little spot there. And I also think we can look at Abraham's life and what God had Abraham do, and knowing that Sarah was with Abraham, I think we can learn some things about Sarah just from thinking about some of the experiences Abraham had that Sarah would have been part of. Maybe, for example, I know the scriptures don't give detail on Sarah, but whenever he was to offer up Isaac, his son. If Sarah had knowledge of that, then there's some things there that Sarah's going through as well. But anyway, maybe there's some things we can think about there. But here's the point that I was wanting to get to. We think of just a little bit of living that Sarah had, and God has not detailed all that man has done from time, right? I mean, God's chosen certain things to tell us about Adam and Eve and so forth, and certain things to tell us about Abraham and Sarah. And we don't have everything that they ever did in their life, but God has chosen us to tell. There's the things that God has chosen us to tell. Old Testament writings. We also learn a few things from the New Testament, but there's the things that God has chosen to tell us from Sarah's life, and even concerning a particular situation. It's not that we necessarily have everything that God, all the details that God gave in a particular situation. We're going to have a situation where, whenever Sarah hears about the fact that God says she's going to have a child in her old age, she does what? She laughs, and then she's asked about it, and she does what? She lies, doesn't she? And it may be that God got onto her for lying. There's nothing recorded in the text. We may not have all the details about that. We know that God condemns lying, but that's just one example where I can see that maybe there was more that happened there with Sarah than what God chose to detail. But here's having said all that, we're getting to this point right here. From all that we know of Sarah, is she a woman of vice or is she a woman of virtue? Yeah, she'd be a woman of virtue. Now we're going to be talking about some women that are women of vice, but she'd be a woman of virtue. Okay, said all that to get to this first page 8 here in just a second. Yes.
Rebecca, after Sarah's death, so he's mourning her. So we see a little bit more of, her son mourned her.
Yeah, and that's a good thing. Her son her son loved her, and I would think just even knowing Isaac's relationship with God, that part of that mourning was because of the kind of person that, and I think maybe that's Regina's point, because of the kind of person that Sarah was. She's a woman of virtue. And any other comments yet? Oh, yeah, Hebrews 11. I'm emphasizing the Old Testament, what we find in the Old Testament. But as we said, there's passages like Hebrews 11 that talks about her faith. 1 Peter talks about her being this woman of hidden beauty. So there's New Testament passages that add to us knowing that she is a woman of virtue. Now, the first point in our book on page 8 says that she was a descendant of Seth and Shem. First of all, is she a descendant of Noah? That's an easy one, isn't it? Because after the flood, everybody's a descendant of Noah. But I did a search right quick, and I asked this question online. Was Sarah a descendant of Seth? And the first response I got said no. Was Sarah a descendant of Shem? The first response I got from a search was no. And there's a reason why they answered that, which I'll get to later. But for right now, we're answering that. Was Sarah a descendant of Seth and Shem? The book says she was. The class book says she was. How do we know she was, but how do we know that?
Given child, Abel was gone, and Cain was shunned. So we kind of assumed it all of
Yeah, that's true. And I think we find that to be true in the scriptures, that the righteous people, what we'll see when we go back to Genesis chapter 4 and we see Cain's line in Genesis chapter 4, there seems to be an emphasis there on people that, for the most part, his line, they didn't have a good relationship with God. And then we get to chapter 5 and we see the line through Seth, and we start seeing a good relationship with God. That doesn't mean that every single person that was in Cain's lineage or perhaps was wicked, or every single person in Seth's lineage was righteous, but I think in general we see that. But look at this passage here for a second. How does this passage, I think this passage proves, do we see Sarah in a list of, in a lineage list? I don't think so. But how would this passage prove that she was a descendant of Seth and of Shem? You have Luke 3, verse 34 through 38. Take a look at that and see. And then we're going to add a few more thoughts to it. And one thing we're leading up to, and Regina just kind of touched on it, if she is a descendant of Seth and Shem, then I think that helps say something about perhaps the kind of woman that she is, because she does have some ancestors who were righteous toward God. But here in Luke 3, nope. Yeah. Luke 3. What did I put down? We're starting with verse 34. Okay, so this is kind of going backwards. We're going from Abraham, actually, yeah, from Abraham, and we get down to, we're actually wanting to get down to Shem and Seth. But, so here's Abraham in verse 34. Abraham was the son of Terah. And then we keep on going, and we see that ultimately Terah can trace his roots back to Shem in verse 36, right? And Terah can also trace his roots back to who else? Seth. Okay, so this passage helps us understand that Abraham is traced back to Terah. Terah is traced back to both Shem and Seth. Now, whose father was Sarah? Whose father was Sarah's father? Terah, same as Abraham. So what does that tell us? Sarah is traced back to Seth and Shem, right? So, and here's another way of looking at it. Her father was Terah, Genesis 20 verse 12. That's what Abraham says, that she's my sister because we have the same father but not the same mother. So Sarah's father was Terah. Terah is a descendant of Shem. So Sarah is a descendant of Shem. Shem is a descendant of Seth. So Terah is a descendant of Seth, and Sarah is a descendant of Seth. Seth. So, and the reason I wanted to maybe point that out and look at that a little bit is because now let's talk about this. And Regina kind of touched on it already. What do we know about the? I don't know why that's going out. Well, did I do that? No. Okay, what do we know about the character of Seth and Shem? Well, let's talk about Seth first. Okay. Woo. You know what that? Yeah. What? Okay.
Shem obviously would have been considered righteous. God saved him along with the rest of Noah's family.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a good point when we think about Shem, but let's go Seth. Seth first. What do we know about Seth? You go back to Genesis chapter, that last part of Genesis chapter 4, whenever Seth is born.
Child given to her in her place. Abel.
Yeah, so there's one point that his mother says, Eve says that, or she I put it this way, she likens Seth to Abel, and I think it's this thought of the difference between Abel and Cain, and Seth was like Abel, replaced Abel. So that speaks about, that's one thing that would speak about Seth's righteousness. What else? What happened whenever Seth was born? men began to do what? Call on the name of the Lord, and that's an expression. Here's a couple other passages, they're found elsewhere too, but Genesis 12:8, Genesis 13 verse 4. That's an expression of worship of God, of relationship with God. And so what we're pointing out is when it comes to Seth, and Sarah is a descendant of Seth, Seth would be one who we would view as being righteous toward God. And so Sarah has this good guy. That's how I put it. I'll make a point on that later. Has this good guy as part of her ancestors. And we just touched on this. We mentioned this a second ago, that it seems to me, as I understand it, Genesis 4, Cain's lineage is, there's a point made there where they're doing their own thing, and there's not really a mention of their relationship with God. But then in chapter 5 through Seth, we see people that we think in general would be righteous. So that's Seth. What do we know about Shem? And Charles brought up one thing about Shem, the fact that when God only saved the righteous with the flood, right? And Shem was one of those. And so we know that Shem, I mean, that's one thing that would tell us that Shem was one of the righteous in Genesis chapter 6. Then what do we see in Genesis chapter 9? Whenever Noah got drunk, was Shem the one that kind of made a big thing about it and looked on his nakedness? Shem was one that took and covered him up. And I think that tells us something else about Shem. And here's the main point I was getting to with all that we've said so far. Sarah is a woman of virtue. I would think that, I mean, I believe that because of some of the righteousness of her ancestors, that ultimately was, as she come on down the line, ultimately had an influence with her. And I know some of that, I mean, that's not always the case. We can have ancestors that are righteous and we can be wicked. Or we can have ancestors that are wicked and we're righteous. But since the book especially brought out the fact that she was a descendant of Seth and Shem, I wanted to talk about that and anyway make the point that perhaps that adds to the fact that she was a woman of virtue because of some of her righteous ancestors. Thoughts or comments? Dallas? Oh.
When Abraham and Sarah would stay with them, and then Abraham chose to obey God and leave eventually.
Yeah. I was, Regina's making mention of the fact that there was some idol worship in the house of Terrace, and I think men have always struggled. Even men who were righteous toward God have always struggled with idolatry sometimes. But right. Through the generations. Mm-hmm. Even if they did do wrong things every now and again. Yeah, we talked about Sarah a little bit, and we'll talk about her again when we get to that point. But even she may or may not have recognized that what she did, as far as saying, "No, I didn't laugh." She may or may not have recognized that as being sin. But even if she did recognize it as being sin, to your point, we're looking at men that were trying to live for God, but they didn't live for God perfectly. We sometimes point that out about David and Bathsheba. Dallas?
Well, I've become played in my question or thought. I mean, the book's title is Vice and Virtue, right? The conjunction and, not or.
Yeah.
And so we talk about that. It's not a perfect life.
Yeah.
Maybe, especially thinking about the New Testament, it's a forgiven life. Repentant life, a life that is striving towards, camping towards God instead of going the other direction.
Yeah, so let's talk about two situations. We can have women of vice, or we can have women of virtue. Now, that's one situation where you're either one or the other. A woman of vice would be who? We named two quick ones right the other day. Jezebel. And why would we call her a woman of vice? Yeah, it's the way of life, right? It's how she's walking, versus Sarah, who's a way of virtue because of the way of life. So that's one way to look at things. The other way to look at things, what Dallas just mentioned, is that you can also have this thought of women of vice and virtue being the same woman. That here's a woman that's trying to live for God, but she's not perfect. So there's going to be some situations in her life where she's going to disappoint God. Did you have a comment?
I think that was very interesting and important to track the Sarah and Abraham to Seth and Shem, and because from then also come the promise and the promises of Christ. And similar like when Joseph and Mary, they come also from David. So that was very much.
Yeah. So Patricia's making the point that it's good to track Sarah to Seth and Shem, and then ultimately because of the promise that God made with Abraham, that ultimately is fulfilled through Christ, including Joseph and Mary. We can especially see Sarah as being a huge part of that, because God first made that promise to Abraham in Genesis 12, and Sarah and Abraham are married. And okay, so anybody else comments or anything? Okay, so let's go to Genesis chapter 11. That was kind of a lead in to where we get to our book on page 8. But let's go to Genesis chapter 11. Now we're going to be looking at some of the text where we, especially the Old Testament text, we'll bring in some New Testament text from time to time, but where we read some things about Sarah. So Genesis 11, the last part, verse 27. Would somebody want to read 27 through the end of the chapter? And a second person. Let me pick on the ladies first. Ladies first. So who likes to read? Okay, Laura. How about Laura? Genesis 11:27 through 32, and then I need somebody for Genesis 12, just the first three verses. Robin, I got Robin's eye. Genesis 12, 1 through 3, and then we'll talk about some things. Okay, Laura.
Terah became the father of Abraham, Nahor, and Haran, and Haran became the father of Lot. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his birth, in Ur of the Chaldeans. Abraham and Nahor took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Sarai was barren; she had no child. Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans in order to enter the land of Canaan. And they went as far as Haran and settled there.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. One more.
The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran.
My verse 32 is the top of the other page. But anyway, so far, one of the things we see is that Abraham and Sarah, and they're going to be leaving their land and ultimately getting to the land of Canaan. Okay, Robin?
Now the Lord had said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you should be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed.
Okay. Got a few questions on this, and this may not be neither here nor there, but I noticed a lot of commentaries view what we read as God telling Terah to come out, and then Abram was a part of that. But did God call Terah? Did God call Abraham? Or did God call them both? And I've got some passages there. Those passages there, it's Abraham speaking, And Abraham is saying, God called me out of my father's house, or God called me out of the land of my birth. And anyway, I ask that just sometimes because of what some of the commentators say. It's not all that important, except I think we do see that the main emphasis is on who? Terah or Abraham? Yeah, Abraham, because that's who God's going to have the promise through. And so I think I would view this as God calling Abraham, and it doesn't mean that Terah couldn't go with him. God called me out of my father's house. It doesn't mean he has to leave his father behind. And so I would view it as God calls Abraham, and then Terah decides to go as well. And then Terah dies where? They get to, they're in Haran. But anyway, any thoughts on that? I wouldn't plan to spend a whole lot of time on that, but just to...
I don't know, is that all you were going to say on that?
Yeah, for me, yeah.
On page 10 in the book, letter F at the top, the question said, or the statement said, the covenant was established with Isaac, who was to be born a year later. I went back to those very verses we just read, unless this covenant mentioned here is different than the land, seed, and nation, because it's pretty clear in chapter 12, 1 through 3, he said it unto Abraham, and I've always taught that too.
Yeah, but I think the thought is that God established his covenant not only with Abraham, but with, but he's just making the point that Isaac, that God also honors this covenant with Isaac. I think that's we're harmonizing all these Bible passages together, and there are several times whenever God re-emphasizes his covenant to Abraham by saying, I'm the God of who? God. Yeah, and there's passages where God's covenant is emphasized not only with Abraham, but with Isaac and with Jacob.
There's something else, the covenant, I wasn't thinking about it. I assumed that was the covenant that he was talking about there. So to me, that wasn't.
Yeah, I think the answer is what we just said there. But if you want to look at it again when we get to that part, we can discuss it more too. Any other thoughts so far? Yeah, I don't know why. I think that like in verse 31, Terah took Abraham his son, etc. And I think that's what causes some commentaries to say that God evidently told Terah to leave. And, did he? Maybe, I don't know. But I know that Abraham says that God called me out of my father's house. Yes.
God called Abraham out of Terah with Linden. And it almost seems like Terah is the one that decided to stay in Haran and kind of help Abraham up. So then finally Terah died, and Abraham gets called again by God. Hey, look, Father's dead now. Let's get going. Let's move.
Yeah.
That might not be right.
But it could be. It can be. We don't have a lot of detail about Terah's involvement or even God directing Terah in some ways. Tommy?
The amazing thing in the story is that it points out God's faithfulness to Sarah. In chapter 11, you start out, the people of the east were wicked. They were trying to build up to heaven, and God had to stop that right there. And then it continues down the genealogy, and that's why the genealogy is told there, because these are the people who are wicked. They're the people who are in the east. But yet God calls them out of that wickedness. He calls both Abraham and Sarah to leave their land, to leave the wicked east, and they're going to follow God. He's going to make them righteous. He's going to make them the great nation, because the people of the east are now destroyed. They're confused. They have no hope, but yet God is going to bring the people out. That's how Sarah's journey starts under God, as he's picking her out and making her righteous.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, and ultimately, what was What was special about the children of Israel? Did God choose them because they were such a special people? No, it wasn't that, but God just made his choice, and what made them special was because of God's choice, and God's going to bring the Messiah through Israel. Anyway, okay, so let's revisit this. Was Sarah Terah's daughter? Yes, Genesis 20. What does it say in Genesis 11, verse 31?
Abraham.
Sarah.
It says she was Abraham's wife. Sarah, his daughter.
Yeah, there you go. And remember, I said I did a search online and asked was Sarah a descendant of Seth and Shem? And the reason that first search came back and said no was because the person was saying we don't know who Sarah's parents were, and they used this verse here to say that she was just the daughter. She wasn't the daughter of Abraham. She was the daughter-in-law. So I guess the question is, why does it say, why does it call her in this passage Abraham or Terah's daughter-in-law? She was both, right? I mean, I don't think it's a great mystery in one sense. She was. Abraham tells us that his father was Sarah's father, but then Abraham married Sarah, and so now she's also a daughter-in-law. Thoughts or comments on that?
If it had said Sarah, my daughter, the emphasis would be more on her instead of an Abraham.
Well, that's a valid point. Gloria's making the point that if it had said Sarah, my daughter, the emphasis, God is going to emphasize Abraham, and so if it said Sarah, my daughter, then maybe there would be more emphasis on Sarah. And instead of Abraham. I mean, anyway, that's a valid point to consider. Yes.
His daughter is going to be Abraham's wife instead of Abraham's mother.
Yeah.
That's what she's going to be.
Yeah, that's another valid point. Where is she in her life right now? She's a wife and going to be a mother, and so that's the emphasis again instead of her being a daughter. Or anyway, but I guess we just wanted to point out that there's no contradiction in saying that because she was a daughter-in-law in one sense.
And it mentions in 29, right, Nahor's wife, Milcah, was also Terah's daughter, and Haran, the daughter of Haran. So she would have been the granddaughter of Terah, and married Nahor. So they're kind of letting those facts be known, but it doesn't mention through there that Sarah was also the daughter of Terah. So it's kind of picking and choosing. Maybe the Israelites here that are reading this knew all that, knew the history, and like Kathy and Gloria said, the importance is that Sarah was Abraham's wife.
Yeah, and y'all bring up some valid points to consider. A bottom line for me is there's no contradiction there. I mean, it's not that somebody can say, well, the Bible isn't true because look at this. This says she's Terah's daughter and this says daughter-in-law. Anyway, okay, so here's another question. What we just read, what's the significance of pointing out that Sarah was barren? Chapter 11, verse 30, chapter 16, verse 1 points it out again. Why would that be significant? Yeah, to show God's glory, that he can bring a whole nation from one who shouldn't be having a child. It's all leading up to that, isn't it? It's all leading up to the fact that God's going to emphasize his power and his faithfulness by giving Sarah a child in her old age. Why would that emphasize his faithfulness? Because that's what he promised, right? And do not both Abraham and Sarah at some point try to help God out because they've gotten older and they think, well, Ishmael, let it be Ishmael. They've gotten older and thinking, they're thinking, well, it can't be somebody from us, right? We're too old. But it is significant that Sarah was barren, and later in chapter 16, because it's going to be an opportunity. God is using this as an opportunity to show his glory, to emphasize his power, and to his faithfulness in blessing Sarah with this child in her old age and fulfilling the promises that he made to Abraham and Sarah. Thoughts, comments?
Made me think of something I heard last night, the adoption thing, and it was saying that sometimes after people try to have a baby and they adopt first, sometimes they get pregnant.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
I know when that happens. It must be just people by God to show that what you're capable of.
Yep.
I don't think it has so much to do with age anymore, because I was reading some of the stuff, and people live to be 900 years old, 175, 127, that's young. Because they wouldn't know how long they were gonna live back then.
Yeah, but
Conceive and have a child at that age.
well, but the text says she was past childbearing, and the text emphasizes Abraham. The reason Abraham and Sarah are both, Abraham laughs too, doesn't he? To start with, the reason they do that is because they can't fathom having a child in their old age, because they are past childbearing. I mean, yeah, Abraham. Can a man as good as dad? Can a man as good as dad have a child?
To women that they would have it at a young age or as soon as they get married, or so. In Terrace, she was very young.
Yep. Yep, it's true.
It's kind of a preview of Christ, because here's Sarah who can't have a child, and miraculously God allows her to have a child who's going to be the seed of promise. And then, of course, in the New Testament of Christ, the ultimate seed being born miraculously through the Holy Spirit.
Yep. Good thoughts?
I just ran the numbers based on what we discussed earlier, the percentage of life. And essentially, if she lived to 80 years old, she would be having maybe 36.
So Jack's saying if she lived to be 80, of course, how old was Sarah when she had the baby? Abraham was 100. There's 10 years difference in their age, so Sarah was 90, and so that would be more than 36, wouldn't it? Or whatever the numbers would be on that, but she'd be up toward her 40s. But anyway, that's why they laughed, because they just didn't see any way, and that's why Abraham says Ishmael. I've not had no child, so Ishmael, and that's why Sarah says what? Abraham, here you can have Hagar. Yeah. Okay.
We know that the tribe have children many years. So that's one reason.
Yeah, Kevin's making the point that they I would say no doubt that probably were trying to have children. Of course, the text makes the point that they hadn't had any children yet, and so you'd be thinking we've gotten older now, and it's just never going to happen. That'd be part of it too. How about a man? I've got 6 through 9, but let's go ahead and read 4. Genesis 12, 4 through 9. One of you men want it? Shane, I'm going to pick on you since I didn't see any eye contact. You got your glasses on? Okay, Genesis 12, 4 through 9.
So Abram departed, as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 70 and 5 years old.
Okay, let's stop for a second. So Abraham was 75 whenever, I mean, they've got to Haran, right? They left Ur of Chaldea, got to Haran, Terrace died, and now God's told Abraham, go on to Canaan, and so now he's 75. Sarah would be 65. Okay, Shane, verse 5, beginning.
Abram took Sarah, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and their substance, and all their substance that they had gathered, and souls they had gotten in Haran,
passed through the land to places. Shechem, land of Moab. Canaanite was then. Lord appeared to Abram and said unto him, see, thy seed will I give this land. There will he an altar unto the Lord who appeared unto him. And remove from hence unto the mountain of the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west, I on the east. And there he built an altar unto the Lord, called upon his name, Lord. And Abram journeyed, going on still toward the south.
Okay, so God tells Abraham to pick up and go from Haran. He does that, just like he did from Ur Chaldee. Did we learn anything about Sarah from this situation? And really, we could go back and ask that question. Did we learn anything about Sarah from them leaving Ur Chaldee and going to Haran, and now leaving Haran and going to the land of Canaan? Any thoughts come to mind about what we could learn about? Okay, she obeyed her husband. So I think there would be submission to husband. Would it be, I know we're talking here about just leaving Haran and going to the land of Canaan, but we're also including whenever God told them to leave Ur. Would that have been difficult for Sarah? Let me ask this, would it have been difficult for Abraham to leave Ur? And then even maybe the life he built in Haran, would that have been difficult for Abraham? It would have. That's why we sometimes emphasize by faith Abraham did. Now, why would it be difficult for Abraham? Same reason to be difficult for Sarah, right? What are some of those reasons?
She knew that's where family was. It's your homeland.
That's your home. Whether you're talking about Ur, or whether you're talking about making a home in Haran, that's your home. That's your comfort zone. That's especially when you think about leaving Ur, you're leaving some relatives, right? You're leaving some friends. You're leaving some family. Some family are going with you, but you're also leaving some. And so I think that tells us something about Sarah, the same way it tells us something about Abraham. By faith, Abraham did this, and Sarah was willing to do that as well. And I think it does tell us something about her submission to her husband. In fact, what New Testament passage do we find that mentions this? Don't look at the board. Yeah, what does 1 Peter 3 starts out by saying what? A woman can win her husband even without a word, by her example, she can win her husband over by her what kind of beauty? Inner beauty. And then what does it say about Sarah? She submitted, calling Abraham Lord, and we understand that just the submission aspect of that, not a dictator type thing, but she submitted, and so the text is implying that, a necessary conclusion for sure is that she's like this woman that has this inner beauty. And so I think we do learn some things about Sarah, even from the fact that when we see that Abraham is sometimes emphasized because he obeyed what God said to do. He left Haran, well, Sarah was right there with him. Thoughts or comments?
Well, not just their husband, but to God too. I mean, same thing, she submitted to Abraham, she was submitting to God as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that out, because it's not just a submission to her husband, and even this woman in 1 Peter is not just it's that's based on submission to God. Yeah.
Verse 6 says that we become her children if we do what is right without being frightened by any fear.
Yeah. So there's an implication of Sarah had enough faith to go and not be afraid. She wasn't fearful so that it kept her from going. Yeah, I appreciate that. We're kind of answering this. Did this take faith on her part? Yes, it did. Did she know where they were going?
She only did as much as Abraham did, right?
Yeah, and what did Abraham know? What does Hebrews 11 say? Abraham went out not knowing where he was going. I mean, God says, you go, and I'm going to take you to a land that I'm going to show you. And so they didn't have a clear vision of where they were going. It's not that they'd been to this place before, and so they're going to go back to this utopia place or whatever. But I think the text is, when it comes to Abraham, God says, I'll show you the place. I'm going to take you to the place. And he emphasizes that Abraham had faith enough to go without not knowing where he was going. Well, we could put Sarah right in that same boat, right? So she demonstrates faith by just as Abraham demonstrated faith. Thoughts or comments? Let me hang on a second. I don't remember when we stopped. Has the first bell already ring? Did the second bell run? Oh, I didn't hear neither one of them. Okay, we'll pick up here Wednesday. Okay, just remember to ask that Wednesday. I didn't hear the bells. Thank you.